had spent my entire life being the afterthought, the second-place finisher in a race I had never even signed up for, the one expected to be quiet, understanding, and endlessly patient, while my older brother, Daniel, was given every opportunity, every ounce of attention, and every single resource our parents had to offer. From the time we were children, it had always been the same pattern. Daniel got the new toys while I got the hand-me-downs. Daniel got piano lessons while I was told they were too expensive. Daniel got a car for his 16th birthday while I was expected to take the bus and learn responsibility. It wasn't outright cruelty, not the kind that leaves bruises or scars, but it was something far worse in its own way. A slow, constant reminder that I just wasn't as important, that I didn't matter as much, that I would always be second no matter how hard I tried. I had told myself for years that it didn't bother me, that I was used to it, that I had built my own success without their help, and that I didn't need their approval or validation to know my own worth. But then came Daniel's wedding, and for the first time in my life, I realized just how deep the favoritism truly ran, how little I had ever meant to them, and how much they were willing to spend on him while giving me absolutely nothing in return. It started with the invitations, glossy and embossed with gold lettering, each one personally delivered in an expensive custom box because, as my mother had put it, Daniel's wedding is an event, not just a ceremony. The venue was a sprawling estate that cost more for one night than I made in an entire year. The guest list was a who's who of local elites, and the catering alone was set to cost more than the down payment on a house. Every single conversation, every single family gathering, every single phone call revolved around wedding details. What shade of white the tablecloth should be, which designer Daniel's fiancée, Rebecca, would be wearing, and how many imported flowers would be needed to line the aisle for their perfect storybook day. I sat through it all, smiling when I was supposed to, nodding in the right places, pretending it didn't sting when my mother gushed about how much Daniel deserved this, how he had worked so hard to build a beautiful life, and how this wedding was their way of showing him how proud they were. And for a while, I told myself that it wasn't a big deal, that weddings were expensive, that of course they would go all out for their only son, and that expecting the same treatment would only lead to disappointment. But then, 2 months later, when I sat down with my parents to tell them I was engaged, everything changed. I had kept it simple, not wanting to make a spectacle out of it, just a quiet dinner at their house, the kind we rarely had anymore, a chance to share the news in a way that felt personal. My fiancé, James, had proposed the week before, nothing extravagant, nothing over the top, just the two of us on a quiet evening, a small, beautiful moment that had felt more real than any grand gesture ever could. I had been excited to tell them, to see if maybe, just maybe, for once they would match that excitement, would see me the way they saw Daniel, would celebrate me the way they had celebrated him. I had barely gotten the words out before my mother let out a polite little laugh, setting down her wine glass with a soft clink against the table. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful," she said, smiling in that vague, distant way that told me she wasn't nearly as interested as she pretended to be. "Have you two thought about eloping? It would be so much easier, so much less stress." I blinked, my heart sinking into my stomach so fast it made me feel sick. "Eloping?" I repeated, forcing a small laugh, convinced I had misheard her. "I mean, I know weddings are expensive, but—" "Oh, it's not just about money," she cut in quickly, waving a dismissive hand, already moving past the conversation like it wasn't important enough to linger on. "It's about simplicity, you know? A wedding doesn't have to be some big production, especially since you're not the type who needs all that attention." Something in me cracked. I sat there, watching as my father nodded in agreement, as my mother turned the conversation back to Daniel's wedding plans, as if my engagement was nothing more than a footnote in someone else's story. They weren't even trying to pretend that I mattered, weren't even attempting to make it seem like they had ever considered treating me equally. And then later that night, when I saw the actual budget for Daniel's—
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Wedding. The 6 figures they had spent without a second thought, the money they had poured into making sure their son had the most extravagant day imaginable. I realized exactly what they had meant. I wasn't worth it. It wasn't about simplicity, it wasn't about stress, it wasn't about anything other than the fact that, in their eyes, I didn't deserve it. They had never once considered spending that kind of money on me, had never even entertained the idea that my happiness was worth investing in. Had never thought that I might want the same kind of support, the same kind of celebration, the same kind of love they had so easily given to Daniel. And that's when something inside me changed. I had spent my whole life accepting the scraps they gave me, pretending I didn't care, convincing myself that it didn't matter, that I was fine with less, that I was fine being invisible. But sitting there, staring at that spreadsheet, seeing the hard numbers that proved just how little I had ever mattered to them, I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel before. Rage. Pure, slow-burning, ice-cold rage. I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and let out a long breath, my fingers drumming lightly against the desk as I stared at the ceiling, letting the anger settle, letting it take root, letting it build into something steady and sharp, something solid and unshakable. If they thought I wasn't worth it, if they thought I didn't deserve what Daniel got, if they thought I would just smile and accept it the way I always had, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Because I wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. I had spent my entire life being the daughter who never made waves, the one who understood when she was given less, the one who didn't complain when Daniel was handed everything on a silver platter while I was expected to settle for whatever scraps were left over. But something about seeing that wedding budget, something about staring at those numbers and realizing that my own parents had never once considered me worth the same kind of investment, flipped a switch inside me that I hadn't even realized existed. For the first time I started asking questions. It began subtly, small, careful conversations slipped into moments when my parents weren't expecting them, casual remarks designed to gauge just how deeply this favoritism ran, just how much they had convinced themselves that Daniel was worth every penny while I was expected to be happy with nothing. At first, they dismissed me with polite, empty responses, telling me that every wedding is different, or that it's not about the money, it's about what makes sense. But when I pushed, when I started asking outright why Daniel's wedding was worth a six-figure budget while I was told to elope, their answers became more pointed, more revealing, more impossible to ignore. "It's different with Daniel," my mother had said over coffee one morning, barely even looking up from her phone as she scrolled through a list of luxury honeymoon destinations she was helping him choose from. "His wedding is an investment in the future, you know? A way to set the right foundation for the kind of life he's building." I had stared at her, my fingers tightening around the warm ceramic of my mug, my jaw locking as I forced myself to keep my voice even, to keep my expression neutral, to pretend that her words weren't cutting through me like a knife. "And mine wouldn't be?" I asked, my tone light, as if I were just curious, as if I weren't holding back the urge to laugh at the sheer audacity of what she had just said. She waved a dismissive hand, finally glancing up at me with that same condescending smile she had always used whenever she thought I was being overly emotional about something that, in her mind, didn't matter. "Oh, honey, you're just different," she said, like that was some kind of explanation, like that was supposed to make me feel better. "Daniel is the kind of person who needs a big, grand wedding. It's just who he is." I didn't even know what to say to that. Instead, I let it sit in the back of my mind, let it fester there. Let it grow into something sharper, something colder, something that didn't feel like the passive resignation I had carried with me my entire life. That weekend, when we all sat down for dinner at one of my parents' favorite upscale restaurants, I decided to push a little harder, to see just how deep their hypocrisy ran, to force them to say the words out loud. "So," I said casually, swirling my wine in my glass, watching the way the dim candlelight caught the deep red color, letting my tone remain light, letting them think this was just idle conversation. "Since you helped Daniel with his wedding, I assume you'll be helping James and me with ours, right?" The silence that followed was brief but telling. A sharp little pause before my mother let out a small, awkward laugh, her fingers twitching slightly against the edge of the table. My father didn't even look up from his steak, cutting into it with slow, deliberate movements, as if pretending he hadn't heard me would somehow make the question disappear. "Oh, sweetheart," my mother finally said, her voice carrying that careful, practiced tone of someone trying to soften a blow before delivering it. "You know it's not about fairness, right? It's about what makes sense for each situation." I nodded slowly, pretending to think about her words, pretending I didn't already know exactly where this was going. "Right," I said, setting my glass down, resting my elbows on the table as I tilted my head slightly, watching them both closely. "So, just so I understand, it made sense to spend over $100,000 on Daniel's wedding, but it doesn't make sense to help me with mine?" Another pause. Then my father cleared his throat, finally looking up from his plate. His expression carefully neutral, as if he had been preparing for this conversation all along. "Sarah, you've always been independent," he said. His voice calm, reasonable, the same way it always was when he was about to say something he thought I should accept without argument. "You've made a great life for yourself, and honestly, we figured you wouldn't want or need our help. You've never been the type to rely on anyone, and that's something we admire about you." I let out a short laugh, shaking my head slightly, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table as I resisted the urge to slam my fist against it. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice sharp now, losing the carefully measured tone I had been holding onto all evening. "Because I never asked for help, you just assumed I didn't deserve it. But Daniel, who has never done a single thing for himself in his entire life, somehow does deserve it. "Sarah, don't be like that," my mother said quickly, her tone shifting into something that sounded dangerously close to annoyance, as if I was being unreasonable for expecting something as basic as fairness. "It's not about who deserves what, it's just what?" I cut in, my pulse pounding now, my nails digging into my palm under the table. Just another way of saying that no matter what I do, no matter how successful I am, no matter how much I don't ask for anything, I will always come second to him. The tension in the air was thick now, uncomfortable, heavy with unspoken truths that had been simmering beneath the surface for years, truths they had always expected me to ignore, truths they had never thought I would challenge. My father sighed, setting his fork down with a quiet clink against the plate. "Sarah, we love you," he said, as if that somehow erased everything else, as if love alone was enough to justify the years of neglect, the years of making me feel like I didn't matter as much as my brother. "But you need to understand that life isn't always about keeping things perfectly equal." I let out a slow breath, nodding slightly, forcing a tight smile as I reached for my purse, standing up from the table in one smooth motion. "You're absolutely right," I said, my voice calm now, steady, controlled in a way that made my mother shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Life isn't fair. And I think it's time I started playing by those same rules." They didn't understand what I meant, didn't see the shift that had just taken place inside me, didn't realize that something had snapped so cleanly that there was no going back, no repairing it, no pretending that I would ever see them the same way again. But they would. Very soon they would. Later that night, as I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, staring at my phone, I made the first call. Not to James. Not to a friend. Not to anyone they would ever expect. And when the voice on the other end answered, I smiled. "Hey," I said, my voice smooth, unwavering. "I think it's time we talked." For the first time in my life, I stopped fighting for fairness, stopped begging for scraps of validation, stopped trying to make them see me as someone worth investing in. And instead, I started playing the game the way they had always played it, calculated, quiet, and completely ruthless. I smiled when they talked about Daniel's wedding. I nodded along when they gushed about the extravagant details. I even pretended to be happy when my mother told me she had bought a new dress specifically for the occasion, one that had cost more than the entire budget she had so graciously suggested for my non-existent wedding. But beneath the surface, beneath the carefully curated facade of the good daughter, I was working, planning, setting up something so perfectly constructed that by the time they realized what I had done, it would be far too late to stop it. The first step was information, because power wasn't just about money or influence. It was about knowing things that other people didn't want you to know, about seeing the cracks in the foundation before anyone else even realized they were there. And so, I started digging, not just into my parents' finances but into Daniel's, searching for anything that could be used, anything that could tip the scales in my favor, anything that could be turned into a weapon when the time came. It wasn't difficult, not really, because people like Daniel, people who had never faced consequences, people who had spent their entire lives being told they could do no wrong, always left trails behind them, always assumed that they were untouchable, always believed that their mistakes would simply disappear. And sure enough, after just a few weeks of quiet, methodical searching, I found exactly what I needed. Daniel was keeping secrets. Big ones. At first, I hadn't been looking for anything specific, just scrolling through old financial records, checking public property databases, digging into anything that might show just how much money my parents had funneled into his life over the years. But then, buried deep in some old transactions, I found something interesting. Payments that didn't quite add up, withdrawals that didn't have clear explanations, wire transfers that led to names I didn't recognize. And when I followed that trail, when I started connecting the dots, the picture that emerged was even worse than I had expected. Daniel had been sending money to a woman who was most definitely not his fiancée. At first, I told myself it could be something innocent, that maybe it was a business arrangement, maybe even a friend he was helping out, but the deeper I went, the more obvious it became that this was exactly what it looked like. There were messages, receipts for expensive gifts, bookings at high-end hotels, all of it pointing to the kind of affair that wasn't just casual, but long-term, ongoing, and very, very serious. And the best part. He was careless, leaving just enough of a trail for me to follow, just enough for me to gather proof. Just enough for me to know that if I played this right, I wouldn't just get even, I would burn his entire perfect life to the ground. But information was only the first step. The second was strategy, because dropping a bomb like this without preparation would be reckless, would be sloppy, would be nothing more than a moment of satisfaction rather than the full-scale reckoning I had in mind. And so, I took my time, weaving myself into the wedding plans, getting closer to Rebecca in a way that made it seem natural, as if I were just the supportive sister-in-law-to-be who wanted to help, who wanted to be involved, who wanted to make sure her brother's fiancé felt welcomed into the family. Rebecca was sweet, almost painfully so, the kind of woman who genuinely believed in fairy tales, in happily ever afters, in the idea that Daniel was her Prince Charming rather than the selfish, cheating fraud I knew him to be. And the more time I spent with her, the more I realized just how much she didn't know, just how deeply she trusted him, just how certain she was that he would never betray her. It would have been easy to pity her, to feel guilty about what I was planning, but then I would think about the years of favoritism, the years of being overlooked, the years of being made to feel like I was nothing, and all that guilt would evaporate, replaced by something colder, something sharper, something that felt like justice. And so, little by little, I began planting seeds, small, subtle comments that weren't quite accusations but weren't entirely innocent either, little remarks about how stressful weddings could be, about how sometimes people made mistakes when they felt pressured, about how important it was to really know the person you were marrying before making a lifelong commitment. I watched as those seeds took root, as Rebecca's smile grew just a little more strained, as the tiny flickers of doubt started appearing in her eyes, as she started asking small, hesitant questions about Daniel's past. Questions he clearly hadn't prepared for, questions he fumbled through answering in ways that only made her more suspicious. By the time the next family dinner rolled around, I knew I had set the stage perfectly. Knew that all it would take was one final push, one small moment of perfectly timed chaos, to send everything crashing down. So I waited. I waited until the wine had been poured, until everyone was relaxed, until the conversation had turned once again to Daniel's perfect, lavish, expensive wedding, until my parents were smiling like proud royalty overseeing their golden sons rise to greatness. And then, with the calmest expression I could muster, I turned to Rebecca and tilted my head slightly, feigning innocent curiosity as I asked the question that would set everything in motion. "So, Rebecca," I said, swirling my wine in my glass, my voice smooth, easy, almost playful, "how do you feel about financial honesty in a marriage? Like, do you think couples should always be upfront about how they spend their money?" Silence. Daniel stiffened beside her, his fingers tightening around his fork just slightly, just enough for me to notice, just enough to confirm that he knew exactly where this was going. Rebecca frowned, glancing at him before turning back to me, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Well, yeah," she said, her voice uncertain, her gaze flickering back to Daniel once more. "I mean, trust is important, right? Why?" I shrugged, taking a small sip of my wine before setting the glass down carefully, deliberately, making sure to drag the moment out just long enough for the tension to build. "Oh, no reason," I said, offering her a small smile before turning my gaze back to my brother, watching as his jaw clenched, as his expression darkened, as the realization of what I had just done started to sink in. "I just think it's interesting how some people define honesty differently than others." Another beat of silence. Then, Daniel's phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with an anonymous email. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the message, his face draining of color as the weight of what he was reading crashed down on him, as the blood drained from his face, as his hands began to tremble just slightly, just enough for me to see, just enough for me to know that he understood exactly what was happening. And as I watched him slowly lift his gaze to meet mine, his expression a mixture of fury and panic, I simply smiled, tilting my head slightly, letting him see that this was only the beginning. The wedding day arrived wrapped in the kind of manufactured perfection that only money could buy, the sky clear, the air crisp, the towering estate venue gleaming under the soft afternoon sun, every single detail meticulously curated to ensure Daniel's wedding would be nothing short of breathtaking. The rows of chairs lined with imported white roses, the chandeliers glinting above the massive reception hall, the carefully selected menu featuring dishes most of the guests wouldn't even be able to pronounce. Everything had been designed to create an atmosphere of luxury, a spectacle of wealth and status, a testament to the fact that my parents would spare no expense when it came to their golden son. I arrived early, dressed in the gown my mother had insisted I wear, a pale champagne-colored designer dress that had cost more than my monthly rent, standing among the crowd of family members and close friends, smiling politely, playing my part, letting them believe that I had finally accepted my place in the carefully constructed hierarchy of our family. I let my mother fuss over my hair, let my father beam at me with that same patronizing approval he had always reserved for moments when I was behaving exactly as expected, let Daniel smirk at me like he had won, like he had somehow erased the tension of the past few weeks simply because no one had confronted him about it. But beneath the surface, beneath the polite laughter and the carefully measured small talk, I was waiting, watching, keeping track of every single moving piece of the puzzle I had so carefully put together. Because today wasn't just about Daniel's wedding, wasn't just about another moment of favoritism, wasn't just about playing the good daughter while he got everything handed to him on a silver platter. Today was about the final, undeniable, public unraveling of the perfect life he had always assumed was untouchable. And he had no idea it was coming. The ceremony went off without a hitch, Rebecca glowing in her designer gown, Daniel standing beside her looking every bit the picture-perfect groom, my parents sitting in the front row with expressions of pure pride, basking in the grandeur of the event they had poured so much money into. Guests whispered about how beautiful everything was, about how stunning the couple looked, about how this was the kind of wedding people dreamed about, the kind of wedding that set the bar impossibly high for anyone who dared to follow. I stood among them, smiling, nodding, agreeing, sipping my drink as I waited for the reception to begin, for the real show to start, for the moment I had spent weeks planning with an attention to detail so precise it would have made my mother proud, if only she had known what was about to happen. Dinner was served, expensive wines were poured, toasts were made, and then finally, as the room buzzed with laughter and celebration, as Daniel and Rebecca sat side by side at the head of the table, smiling like nothing in the world could touch them, the moment arrived. The doors at the back of the reception hall opened quietly, unnoticed at first, the sound of heels clicking softly against the polished floor barely audible over the chatter of the crowd. But then, slowly, the shift began, conversations faltering, heads turning, eyes widening as people registered the unexpected guest making her way toward the center of the room, moving with a kind of deliberate, unwavering confidence that only someone with nothing left to lose could possess. And then, just as Daniel lifted his champagne glass, just as he prepared to launch into whatever smug, self-congratulatory speech he had planned, he saw her, his ex-girlfriend, the one he had cheated on Rebecca with, the one he had strung along for months while planning a future with someone else, the one who was now standing just feet away from him, wearing a sleek black dress that contrasted sharply against the soft pastels and golds of the wedding decor, holding a small leather-bound notebook in one hand, her other resting casually on her hip, her expression unreadable but sharp, her gaze locked onto Daniel with a kind of quiet fury that sent a chill through the air. The silence in the room was deafening. Rebecca turned to Daniel, her brow furrowing, confusion flickering across her face, her fingers tightening around his arm. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice low, uncertain, not yet aware that the entire foundation of her life was seconds away from crumbling beneath her. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. Because in that moment, as the color drained from his face, as his mouth opened and closed uselessly, as the weight of what was happening settled over him like a suffocating force, he realized exactly what I had done. The ex-girlfriend smiled then, slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that promised nothing but destruction, the kind of smile that sent a ripple of nervous energy through the crowd. She lifted the notebook slightly, flipping it open, revealing a neatly organized collection of printed messages, screenshots, and transaction receipts. Every single piece of evidence meticulously compiled, every lie, every betrayal, every secret laid out in perfect, irrefutable detail. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying across the room, clear and sharp and unwavering. "I thought since you love making speeches, you might want to explain these." She took a step closer, holding up a page with a kind of damning clarity that no one could argue against. A message exchange with a timestamp that overlapped with the engagement, a hotel confirmation dated just weeks before the wedding, a wire transfer that lined up perfectly with the payments I had discovered. Rebecca inhaled sharply, her entire body stiffening, her grip on Daniel's arm loosening, her expression morphing from confusion to realization to absolute, unfiltered fury. "You cheated on me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with a kind of raw devastation that made the entire room feel like it had been drained of oxygen. Daniel stammered, his carefully crafted composure cracking like glass, his hands lifting in a weak, desperate attempt to control the situation, to regain even a sliver of power. "Rebecca, I can explain." "Explain," she repeated, laughing, a short, hollow sound that held no humor, only disbelief. "Explain what, exactly? How you've been lying to me for months. How you let me stand up there and say my vows while knowing you were sleeping with someone else." She didn't wait for an answer. Instead, with a sharp inhale, she pulled off her wedding ring, turned on her heel and walked out, her gown billowing slightly behind her, the click of her heels against the marble floor the only sound in the room as everyone watched in stunned silence. And Daniel, the golden son, the pride of my parents, the man who had been handed everything without consequence, sat there, humiliated, abandoned, exposed in front of hundreds of guests, his perfect life shattered beyond repair. I lifted my champagne glass, taking a slow sip, letting the bubbles linger on my tongue, savoring the moment, the chaos, the way my mother sat frozen in disbelief, the way my father looked like he had just been punched in the gut, the way Daniel's entire world had collapsed in a single instant. And then, finally, as the whispers began, as the first guests started to gather their things, as the reality of what had just happened settled into the walls of the perfect, extravagant wedding that would now be remembered for all the wrong reasons, I set my glass down, crossed my legs and smiled. Because this was only the beginning. The message arrived late at night, long after the chaos of Daniel's wedding had settled into the kind of uneasy silence that follows an explosion, the kind that lingers like dust in the air, thick and suffocating, impossible to ignore. I had expected fallout, had anticipated anger, had prepared myself for the inevitable phone calls filled with screaming, for the desperate attempts to salvage what was left of the wreckage, for my parents to call me ungrateful, spiteful, vengeful, to accuse me of tearing the family apart. But what I hadn't expected, what I hadn't even considered, was that I would be the one receiving a message first. And not from Daniel, not from my mother, not from my father, but from their lawyer. I sat there staring at the screen, my fingers hovering over the phone, my mind running through every possible reason he would be reaching out to me, every scenario that could have led to this, every secret that might still be waiting in the shadows, ready to be dragged into the light. Finally, after a long measured breath, I tapped the notification, opening the email with the same kind of detached curiosity I had felt when I first started digging into my family's finances, when I first realized that nothing in our house was as perfect as it had always seemed. Sarah, I believe there's some financial information you need to be made aware of. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. No explanation, no details, just a short, clipped message that carried the weight of something much bigger, something heavier, something that made my stomach twist with a mixture of anticipation and certainty. Because I had spent weeks pulling at threads, weeks searching for cracks in the foundation, weeks trying to understand why my parents had been so willing to drain their savings for Daniel while insisting they couldn't spare a single dime from me. And now I was about to find out exactly why. The next morning, I sat in the lawyer's office, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my expression calm as he sifted through a stack of documents, pausing occasionally to glance at me with something that almost resembled sympathy. He had been our family's lawyer for years, had handled everything from property transfers to tax filings, had been present for every major financial decision my parents had ever made. Which meant that if anyone knew the truth, it was him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he set the papers down, leaned back in his chair, and steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he said slowly, carefully, like he was choosing every word with surgical precision. "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear." I didn't flinch. "Go on." He exhaled through his nose, tapping one of the documents with a single finger before sliding it across the desk toward me. "Your parents have been using funds from an inheritance left by your grandfather," he said. His voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "An inheritance that was meant to be split equally between you and Daniel." I stared at the document in front of me, my eyes scanning the neatly typed paragraphs, the legal jargon that outlined exactly what had happened, the bank statements that detailed where the money had gone, the signatures that confirmed every single transaction. And there it was, clear as day, written in cold, irrefutable ink. The money was supposed to have been divided between us. But instead, they had taken nearly all of it, almost every last cent, and poured it into Daniel's wedding, into his future, into making sure he had everything he could possibly need while I was left with nothing. I felt something sharp twist in my chest, a slow-burning rage that started deep in my stomach and curled its way up my spine, settling into my bones like fire, like ice, like something that had been waiting to be unleashed for years. "How much is left?" I asked, my voice calm, controlled, a stark contrast to the storm raging beneath my skin. The lawyer hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he reached for another document, flipping it open, running a finger down the page before stopping at a number that made my breath catch in my throat. Less than 10%. That was all that remained of what should have been mine, of what had been promised to me, of what my grandfather had left behind with the intention of giving both of his grandchildren an equal chance at a stable future. They had stolen from me, had made financial decisions on my behalf without my knowledge, had taken what wasn't theirs to take, had used the money to secure Daniel's life while telling me to figure mine out on my own. I sat there for a long time, staring at that number, letting the reality of it settle over me, letting it sink into the deepest parts of me, letting it fuel the last piece of the plan I hadn't even known I needed. Then, without another word, I stood, gathered the documents, and walked out of the office. The family meeting was set for that evening, a forced gathering that my parents had insisted on after the wedding disaster, an attempt to restore order, to reprimand me for what I had done, to make it clear that I had crossed a line. They had no idea that by the time the night was over, it wouldn't be me facing consequences. It would be them. I arrived at the house early, walking into the living room to find my mother pacing near the fireplace, my father sitting stiffly on the couch, Daniel slouched beside him. his face still pale from the events of the wedding. His eyes burning with the kind of hatred that told me he blamed me for everything that had gone wrong in his life. I sat down across from them, carefully placing the folder of legal documents on the coffee table, tapping my fingers against the cover as I met my mother's gaze head-on. "Before we start," I said, my tone even almost casual, "there's something you should know." She frowned, crossing her arms, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Sarah, if you're here to make excuses for what you did." I cut her off with a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Oh no," I said, tilting my head slightly. "I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to talk about the money." My father stiffened. Daniel's jaw clenched. My mother blinked, her expression shifting just slightly, just enough for me to see the first flicker of unease, just enough for me to know that deep down, she already understood exactly where this was going. I flipped open the folder, pulled out the first document, and slid it toward them, watching as my father's face drained of color, as my mother's lips parted slightly in shock, as Daniel's eyes darted between them with something close to confusion. "This is a breakdown of the inheritance Grandpa left us," I said, my voice steady, my fingers tapping lightly against the page. "The one that was supposed to be split between Daniel and me. The one you used to fund his wedding." Silence. Heavy. Then finally my father exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face as he muttered, "Sarah, this isn't what you think." "Oh, it's exactly what I think," I said, leaning back, crossing my legs as I let the weight of my words settle over them like a hammer. "And I want my share. Every cent." My mother let out a shaky breath, her hands tightening into fists, her jaw clenching as she tried to maintain control, as she searched for a way out of the mess they had created. But there wasn't one. Because this time, they weren't the ones holding the power. It was. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on, stretching out like a drawn bowstring, filled with the weight of everything that had just been said, with the undeniable truth that none of them had ever expected to face. My father stared at the documents in front of him, his jaw tight. His fingers clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles turned white. His carefully composed facade slipping with every passing second. My mother, always the one to smooth things over, always the one to manipulate a situation back into her control, looked pale and shaken, her lips pressed together so tightly they had nearly disappeared, her breath coming out in uneven, measured exhales. And Daniel, sitting in the corner of the couch like a sulking child, was still struggling to fully process what was happening, still looking between them like he was waiting for one of them to fix it, waiting for someone to swoop in and save him the way they always had. But no one was coming to save him this time. "I can't believe you're doing this," my mother finally said, her voice low and unsteady, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair as if she were trying to ground herself, as if she were trying to hold onto the last remnants of the world she had so carefully built around Daniel. "After everything we've done for you, after all the ways we've supported you, this is how you repay us?" I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I crossed my legs, keeping my expression neutral, keeping my voice calm, even though I could feel the fire burning beneath my skin, even though I could feel the years of resentment curling in my chest like a tightly wound spring finally snapping free. "Everything you've done for me," I repeated, tilting my head slightly, watching as she shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, as my father let out a sharp exhale through his nose. "Please tell me exactly what that entails, because from where I'm sitting, the only thing you've ever done for me is remind me that I will always come second to him." Daniel scoffed, rolling his eyes, his arms crossing over his chest as he let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking his head as if I was the one being unreasonable, as if I was the one who had crossed the line. "Oh, come on, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with that same arrogance, that same entitlement that had been drilled into him since birth, that same unshakable belief that he was untouchable. "Are you seriously trying to act like a victim here? Like your life has been some kind of tragic struggle? You have a great job, you have a fiancé, you have everything you need. Why the hell are you being so petty about this?" I turned to look at him then, really looked at him, at the man who had been handed everything, at the brother who had spent his entire life never having to fight for anything, at the person who had never once considered how his privilege came at the expense of someone else. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, keeping my voice level, keeping my expression steady, letting him see exactly how serious I was, exactly how much I wasn't playing his game anymore. "You don't get it, do you?" I asked, watching as his smug expression faltered just slightly, as his confidence wavered under the weight of something he had never been forced to confront before. "This isn't about the money, Daniel. This isn't about you getting a big wedding or our parents spoiling you or even the fact that they clearly think you're the second coming of Christ. This is about respect. This is about fairness. This is about the fact that they stole from me, took what was rightfully mine, so that you could have a wedding that ended up being nothing but a public embarrassment. His jaw tensed, his fingers tightening against his arms. His entire body stiffening as the reminder of his ruined wedding settled over him like a crushing weight, as the reality of what had happened, of how spectacularly his perfect little world had fallen apart, finally started to sink in. Rebecca had left him. His reputation was in ruins. His financial security, the one thing he had always counted on, the one thing he had always assumed would be there to catch him if he ever fell, was now in jeopardy. And now, he was finally beginning to realize that without our parents holding him up, without their endless supply of money and resources and unwavering support, he was nothing. My father let out a sharp breath, leaning forward, rubbing his temples, his patience wearing thin, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "Sarah, let's be reasonable," he said. His voice laced with exhaustion, with an edge of forced diplomacy, as if he thought he could still negotiate his way out of this, as if he thought he could still convince me to let it go. "There's no need to involve lawyers in this, no need to make this uglier than it already is. We're family, and at the end of the day, money isn't worth tearing a family apart over." I raised an eyebrow, tilting my head slightly, letting the weight of his words settle before responding. "Interesting," I said, my tone smooth, almost amused. "Because I don't remember you saying that when you decided to drain my inheritance to pay for Daniel's wedding." Another silence. A sharp inhale from my mother, a clenched jaw from my father, a flicker of something dangerously close to panic in Daniel's eyes. They knew they had lost, and they hated it. I stood then, slow and deliberate, gathering the legal documents back into their folder, sliding it neatly under my arm before meeting my father's gaze one last time, making sure he saw exactly how much power had shifted, exactly how much control he no longer had. "I'll expect the money to be transferred by the end of the month," I said, my voice firm, unwavering, absolute. "If it's not, we can settle this in court. Your choice." Then, without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving them to sit in the ruins of everything they had built, to stew in the mess they had created, to finally understand what it felt like to lose. By the time I got home, my phone had been flooded with missed calls, with frantic texts from my mother, with desperate attempts to reason with me, to manipulate me, to guilt me into backing down. But I ignored every single one, tossing my phone onto the kitchen counter, pouring myself a glass of wine, and for the first time in my life, feeling something that I had never truly experienced before. Control. I had taken back what was mine. I had shattered the illusion they had spent years building. I had walked away with everything they told me I couldn't have. And as I sat there, swirling my wine in my glass, my phone buzzed again, another message lighting up the screen, a new name appearing in my notifications. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." And just like that, I knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. Months had passed since I had walked out of my parents' house. Months since I had torn down the illusion they had spent years building. Months since I had taken back what was mine and left them to deal with the fallout of their own betrayal. In that time, I had done what I should have done years ago. I had cut ties completely, severing every remaining thread that connected me to a family that had never truly seen me as their equal, a family that had spent my entire life making sure I knew exactly where I stood. At first, there had been resistance, desperate attempts to pull me back in, calls from my mother filled with half-hearted apologies and carefully worded guilt trips, messages from my father demanding that I be reasonable, that I not let money be the thing that destroyed our family. But I had ignored every single one, letting them sit unanswered in my inbox, watching as the messages grew less frequent, as the calls became less urgent, as they slowly began to realize that I wasn't coming back, that I wasn't going to let them drag me into their world again, that I had finally, completely freed myself from them. And in their absence, my life had flourished. Without the constant weight of their expectations, without the endless comparisons to Daniel, without the suffocating knowledge that no matter what I did, I would never be good enough for them, I had built something entirely my own. My career had taken off, my relationship with James had never been stronger, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, wasn't waiting for the next inevitable reminder that I was second best, wasn't forcing myself to shrink just to fit into the small, convenient version of myself they had always wanted me to be. I should have felt free. And for the most part I did. But then, one evening, just as I was settling in for the night, my phone buzzed with a new message. I expected it to be James, maybe a friend, maybe a work notification I had forgotten to turn off. But when I glanced down at the screen, my breath caught slightly, my fingers hovering over the device as I read the name staring back at me. A name I hadn't seen in months, a name I had nearly forgotten about in the midst of moving forward. Daniel. For a long time I just stared at it, my pulse slow and steady, my mind blank in a way that was almost unsettling, as if my body hadn't quite decided how to react yet, as if part of me had already known this moment would come eventually. Finally, after what felt like forever, I opened the message. Daniel. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but can we talk? Please. A deep sigh left my lips as I leaned back against the couch, rubbing a hand over my face, my mind already running through every possible reason he could have for reaching out, every scenario in which he would suddenly decide that after all this time, after everything that had happened, after everything I had done to take back control, he wanted to talk to me now. I had seen bits and pieces of what his life had become since the wedding disaster, had heard through mutual acquaintances that things had gone downhill fast, that Rebecca had not only left him but had made sure their breakup was public, that the embarrassment of their ruined wedding had followed him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. His career had taken a hit, his finances were stretched thin, and without our parents constantly propping him up, he was learning, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it felt like to truly struggle. And now, just as I had finally moved on, just as I had finally carved out a life free from him and the people who had always put him first, he wanted to talk. I didn't know if it was an apology, an attempt at reconciliation, or just another desperate attempt to drag me back into the mess he had made, but I did know one thing. Whatever it was, whatever he had to say, whatever he thought this conversation would accomplish, it wouldn't change anything. I had won. And I wasn't about to let him pull me back in. But just as I was about to set my phone down, just as I was about to ignore the message and let it sit there unanswered like so many others before it, another notification popped up. Second message. But this one wasn't from Daniel. This one was from someone unexpected. I sat up straighter, my fingers tightening around the phone as I read the name on the screen, my heartbeat suddenly louder than it had been just seconds before, a strange, unfamiliar sensation creeping up my spine, something uneasy, something uncertain, something that made the air in the room feel just a little bit heavier. The subject line was simple. We need to talk. And just like that, the past wasn't quite as finished as I thought it was.